I'm agreeing to everyone into this truth, both new and season. And in this video today, I'm going to be touching on sex before marriage. Is it unlawful to have sex outside of marriage in the eyes of the Lord our God? And is it fornication? If there's one thing we know for certain, truth speaks volumes. First off, it's important to know what fornication actually is. So the word itself, fornication, what does it mean? Fornication in Hebrew is zana, and it means to commit fornication, to be a harlot, play the harlot, to be a harlot, act as a harlot, commit fornication, to commit adultery, to be a cult prostitute, to be unfaithful, in brackets, to God. For those not aware, fornication was at times used to describe the sins of man against God. An example is in Hosea chapter 16, starting from verse 1. It wasn't fornication in a sexual sense, but was used to describe the disobedience and sinful ways against the Lord our God. Continuing, to play the harlot, to cause to commit adultery, to force into prostitution, to commit fornication. Fornication in Greek is porneia, and it means illicit sexual intercourse, which means unlawful sex. Adultery, fornication, homosexuality, lesbianism, intercourse with animals, etc. Sexual intercourse with close relatives, which can be seen in Leviticus chapter 18. Sexual intercourse with a divorced man or woman. This we will touch on later on in the video. The worship of idols, of the defilement of idolatry, as incurred by eating the sacrifice offered to idols. Now I'm about to go to events within the Bible where sexual act was deemed as a sin, starting with 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting from verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife. Let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due to benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. But I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as myself, but every man have his own proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. And when it says burn, it means to burn with passion. And passion in Greek is pastro, and it means to be affected or have been affected, to feel, have a sensible experience, to undergo, in a good sense, to be well off, in good case, in bad sense, to suffer badly, be in a bad plight, of a sick person, to be affected by a thing, whether good or bad, to suffer, endure evil. And in this instance, we can say it was in a bad sense. Why? It's important to understand what Paul was addressing in this text, and the why. And it was due to a problem that was happening within the church of Corinth. What problem was that? Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, starting from verse 1. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans. For a man has his father's wife, and you are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. So when they're speaking of fornication, it was due to a man sleeping with his father's wife. But as we know, fornication is used in different formats. Adultery is just one of them. But even if you don't know, that's the reason for me making this video, so stay tuned. Adultery means to sleep with another man's wife, not to sleep with a single woman whilst in marriage. King David being a perfect example. He slept with Uriah the Hittite's wife Bathsheba. It might sound crazy, but biblically if a married woman sleeps with an unmarried man, it is seen as adultery in the eyes of the Lord. However, if a man sleeps with an unmarried woman whilst in a marriage, it's not. It seems unfair, but that's just what the reality is in the scriptures. And I'm just the person relaying this and breaking it down to the people. But this is God's laws, not mine. So to conclude what 1 Corinthians chapter 7 was saying, it is good for you not to have sex, but to avoid sexual immorality it's best to get married. But he said this as a personal advice, not as commandment, which is important to highlight because we're about to get into more. Matthew chapter 5 starting from verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Let's get into the meaning of the word adultery, which is mekeo in Greek, which means to be an adulterer, to commit adultery with, have unlawful intercourse with another's wife, of the wife to suffer adultery, be debauched. So in the scripture when it says to look at a woman with lust, you have committed adultery in your heart, it's talking about another man's wife, because that's what adultery is, which we have now established. To furthermore corroborate my point, let's take a dive into the story of King David committing adultery. 2 Samuel chapter 11, starting from verse 1. And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servant with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an evening tide that David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her. For she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. So this is another act of adultery. I won't read the whole story because I want to stay on topic, but for a brief summary of what happened, Bathsheba became pregnant, and Uriah the Hittite husband of Bathsheba was sent into war at the front line deliberately by King David to die. So King David didn't only commit adultery, but set up Uriah the Hittite to die in war. And after he did, King David married Bathsheba. So we've already touched on the word fornication and its meaning both in Greek and Hebrew. Now I want to touch on something I spoken earlier in this video, when we was going through the meaning of the word fornication in Greek. One of the meanings said sexual intercourse with a divorced man or a woman. The reason for this is there's no such thing as divorce in the Bible. Let's touch on that. Matthew chapter 19 starting from verse 1. And it came to pass that when Jesus had finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came into the coast of Judea beyond Jordan. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said unto them, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore there are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. They say unto him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement, and to put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery. His disciples say unto him, If the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. But he said unto them, All men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs, which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs, which were made eunuchs of men. And there be eunuchs, which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So unless the woman has committed fornication against the man is not allowed to put away his wife. And you see the key word, the man put away his wife. The woman didn't have no authority to even ask or request for a divorce. So all of this was through the man. So in other words, there is no such thing as divorce unless the woman commits an act of sexual immorality. And Christ said the only reason why Moses made a written divorce a thing is due to the hardness of the hearts, but that is no longer. And that's why it's stated in Matthew 19 chapter 9, if you put away your wife except for sexual immorality and then get married to another woman, you commit adultery. And any man that marry your wife also commit adultery, because in the eyes of the Lord thy God, the union between you two is still an active marriage. And one might ask, so if it's only if the woman commits an act of sexual immorality, what if the man commits an act of sexual immorality? Well, that woman still has to carry out her role as a wife. So one's act or another person's act shouldn't be a green light for you to also do the same thing. God will deal with that person. So marriage is deeper than what a lot of people actually think and believe it to be. Let's go to the verse where the Moses law of divorcement was written. Deuteronomy chapter 24, starting from verse 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorcement and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs of his house. And if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So this is what the Matthew 19 text on divorce was related to. Genesis chapter 2, starting from verse 21. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, down from verse 15. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexual immoral person sins against his own body. So in this text, Paul says your bodies are members of Christ. Should he then take members of Christ and join them to a prostitute? And then he says never. He who is joined to a prostitute becomes one flesh. So when it says joined, it means to cleave to. Let's take a look at the definition. And the word in Greek is kala, which means to glue together, cement, fasten together, to join or fasten firmly together, to join oneself to, cleave to. Now to cleave to someone is to join, which is through marriage, not just sleeping with someone, because that's not what God put together. Mark chapter 10 starting from verse 6. But from the beginning of the creation God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So then they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. So God put Adam and Eve together, which is a marriage within itself. So when it spoke of sexual immorality in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, which we touched on, it wasn't speaking about sex before marriage. Because if sleeping with someone automatically made that person your wife, then in the book when the men had concubines, those concubines would have also been their wives. But that wasn't the case. We're going to touch on that further on in the video. I'm not against marriage. And to stop yourselves from sexual immorality, it's best to get married. But even then, fast and pray that you don't become overpowered with the love of sex, that you get tempted by Satan, like Paul mentioned. I just believe that it's important to understand what fornication means and the acts of it. Because then you start to make judgment on people and say, yeah, they're sinning against God, or what they're doing is sexual immorality. When in all actuality, it's not sinning against God or His word. Throughout the Bible, we've seen many men of God take on women as concubines, which is seen outside of marriage legally, but it was never looked upon as a sin in the eyes of God. And an example being 2 Samuel chapter 5 starting from verse 12. And David perceived that the Lord had established him over the Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. And David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem, after he was come from Hebron. And there were yet sons and daughters born to David. Another example being Sarah and Hagar. Hagar was the maid of Sarah before she gave her to Abraham. Bilhah and Zilpah, also another example. Rachel and Leah was the wives of Jacob, and Bilhah and Zilpah were his concubines, which was given to Jacob by his wives. Bilhah was the maid of Rachel, given to her by her father Laban. He was first his maid. The same thing with Zilpah. Zilpah was the maid of Leah, which was given to her by her father Laban. So Bilhah and Zilpah was the maids of the father of Rachel and Leah before they became their maids. Majority of the time, the concubines were maids for other people, whether it be for a main wife or a man's home outside of their fathers. So for that reason, their position wasn't that of a wife, like a Sarah or a Rachel or a Leah or a Rebecca. They were of higher echelon, and the women given as wives were for the most part virgins. The word concubine is frowned upon by many in modern times, but in all actuality, concubines have the same attributes of a wife, but their status is just lower. Concubine in the Hebrew is pilgesh, and it means a concubine, a female, unmarried sexual and interpersonal companion of social and legal status, inferior to that of a wife. So one might ask, where did the whole sex before marriage concept stem from? And it was from a man called St. Augustine, who was Bishop of Hippo, which is based in Algeria. St. Augustine, born Aurelius Augustinus, was born in 354 AD in Thagaste, modern Souk Aras, in Algeria. He died in 430 AD. Augustine became bishop in 395, or 96, and spent the rest of his life in that office. Now, what I'm about to read about St. Augustine will give you an idea on the sex before marriage being a sin concept. Now, from adolescence to the age of 32, as he later detailed in the Confessions, Augustine was a frequent loser in the battle with lustful passions. However, his struggles with sexuality actually began before his arrival at the decadent North African metropolis of Carthage. He later wrote that it was at the age of 16 the frenzy gripped me and I surrendered myself entirely to lust. Both his parents were aware that he was floundering in the broiling sea of fornication, but each responded differently. His father, who seems to have also been entangled in extramarital affairs, was amused at his son's budding sexual interests. The prospect of grandchildren, legitimate or otherwise, appealed to Patricius. Patricius was the father of Augustine, and his mother was Monica. Monica, on the other hand, was caught in a dilemma. She did not suggest marriage for quelling the sexual fires, because she feared that a hurried marriage would hinder her gifted son's career opportunities. At the same time, she earnestly warned him about his lack of sexual restraint, saying above all, do not seduce any man's wife. As an 18-year-old student at Carthage, Augustine reveled in promiscuity. Sex had become an obsession for him. From a perverted act of will, he wrote, desire had grown, and when desire is given satisfaction, habit is forged. And when habit passes unresisted, a compulsive urge sets in. After a year of promiscuity in that university city, Augustine settled down with a mistress. Although he never revealed her name, he remained with her for more than a decade. She bore him a son named Adultery. The young scholar had become a professor of rhetoric in Milan. When Monica, his ever-persistent mother, persuaded him to send his unnamed mistress away so that he might acquire the hand of a high society Milanese girl. So remember in the scriptures where we read, if you put away your wife and she marries someone else, that she commits adultery. This can also be related to it. And bearing in mind, Monica was said to be a follower of Christ as well. So the fact that that was the advice in which she gave to her son Augustine for him to marry someone of a higher status showed the selectiveness of picking and choosing when wants to abide by the word of God. But continuing, part of the arrangement was that Augustine had to remain chaste for 2 years, that is, until the girl reached marriageable age. But his sexual passions prevented him from keeping his part of the bargain. Not long after sending away the mother of Adultery, he took another mistress. I thought it should be too miserable. He lamented, unless folded in female arms. As he came to accept the truth of Christ, one great obstacle that deterred him from fully embracing Christianity was his sexual proclivity. After his conversion, he had much to say about sex and marriage. The fall of Adam, he taught, drastically affected human sexuality. In particular, human nature had fallen under the compulsive power of concupiscence, or lust, which he understood as the passionate, uncontrolled element in sexuality. Augustine believed that all sexual intercourse, even within the bounds of Christian marriage, involved concupiscence, which is why Paul said what he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. Like many other fathers of the church, Augustine developed some of his major ideas in response to particular movements and issues. After his conversion to Christianity, his early personal experience with Manichaeism alerted him to the danger that it posed to the faith of the church. He rose to the condemnation of marriage by describing in great detail why marriage was a good thing. At the same time, his early sexual experience led him to believe that human beings were cursed with an inability to control their passions. So, by St. Augustine having a lack of self-control, it seems he was conveying everyone else is not capable of self-control either due to his experiences For those who are curious on what Manichaeism is, it's a dualistic religion founded by Mani in Persia in the 1st century AD. Inspired by a vision of an angel, Mani viewed himself as the last in line of prophets that included Adam, Buddha, Zoroaster, and Jesus. His writings, now mostly lost, formed the Manichaean scriptures. Mani was said to be an Iranian prophet. Now continuing. Augustine strongly defended the goodness of marriage against the Manichaeans because he understood that marriage was part of God's plan. God created humankind as having two sexes for the purpose of procreation. Having children necessitated raising them, and for this, marriage was the best way to accomplish the task. Within marriage, sexual intercourse for the purpose of having children is blameless. The carnal pleasure that the spouses experience represents God's manner of inducing a man and woman to have children and raise a family. Outside of this, however, sexual intercourse that takes place at any time when procreation is not possible, as when the woman is pregnant or the couple are old, is sinful. If one chooses to engage in sexual intercourse primarily for the sake of pleasure, regardless of whether procreation is possible, this he considered to be a sin of lust, albeit a minor sin. Augustine's reasoning here is that sin basically consists in averting one's attention away from God. Paul told us not to be driven by lust and should fast and pray, but it's not a sin to have sex with your woman. That doesn't make sense to me. But continuing. So St. Augustine has said sex outside of marriage is a sin. And on top of that, if you have sex in marriage without the intention to procreate, it's also a sin. In the state of paradise, Adam and Eve would have been able to procreate children purely as a matter of intelligent choice. It was also only after the fall that they needed to be enticed to have intercourse by the promise of pleasure. However, because of concupiscence, an effect of original sin, they would not be able to control their pleasure, and it would inevitably get out of hand. Thus he taught the sexual intercourse is only legitimate for the purpose of having children. It should be added here that Augustine's pastoral sense led him to observe that if a couple were fairly sure that procreation would not come about through an act of intercourse, and one of the partners requested having intercourse at that time, only the requesting party would be burdened with a minor sin. The responding party would be expected to oblige the request because they are bound to render martial debt. It seems to me that St. Augustine was adding to the Bible and leaning on his own understanding, which the Bible tells you not to do. Nowhere in the Bible does it state that a man having sex with his woman without the intention to procreate is a sin. This is where things start getting out of hand. Proverbs chapter 3, starting from verse 1. My son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments. For length of days and long life and peace shall they add to thee. Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck, write them upon the table of thine heart. So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and men. Deuteronomy chapter 4, starting from verse 2. Ye shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall ye diminish aught from it, that ye may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. I hope I was able to edify everyone in this video today. Stay blessed and stay safe.